So a few months ago, Atlanta and Marietta were subjected to flyers and protests against Jews by the so-called Goyim Defense League. What the media did not report what was actually on the placards that they carried at their protest outside the Chabad synagogue on Lower Roswell. Their placards read something like, Leo Frank was a pedophile, and so, by extension, are all Jews. Believe it or not, the current neo-Nazis and the white nationalist movement have adopted Leo Frank as their boogeyman, as their byword. Although some of these white nationalist groups are small, they do encourage anti-Semitic activities that attack Jews and Jewish organizations. And they use the Frank case as justification for their anti-Jewish animus. Just this past year, the play Parade, the play about the Frank case, was revived on Broadway and it won the Tony Award. But even in New York City, even on Broadway, close to the theater, there were anti-Semitic placards and anti-Semitic propaganda against Leo Frank. One of the organizations that monitors hate groups explained to me, every neo-Nazi in America knows who Leo Frank was. So for this, and for so many reasons, the Frank case is still important. Now, I've spoken on the Frank case before from this bema about 4 or 5 years ago. I hope you'll pardon me if I revisit the topic once more. You see, I've never actually explained the ins and the outs of the Frank case. And so because current anti-Semitism and its relationship to Leo Frank is still so relevant in 2023, I thought I might take my 20 minutes or so to give you the fuller picture of what actually happened exactly 110 years ago. In April 1913, Mary Fagan went to her place of work in Atlanta, the National Pencil Factory. She was given $1.20 from the superintendent of the factory, Leo Frank. The 13-year-old girl was never seen alive again. It was the tragic beginning of what was to become the most notorious murder case in the history of Georgia. Early the next morning, on April the 27th, her body, covered in soot and grime, was discovered in the basement of the factory by the watchman Newt Lee. Upon discovering the body, Lee called the Atlanta police, who arrived within the hour. But not yet familiar with today's police procedure, several policemen, detectives, and then a reporter traipsed through the basement, destroying much of whatever forensic evidence there might have been. Except for one thing. There was on the wall a bloody handprint, presumably left by the killer. And for reasons unknown to this speaker, the police overlooked the handprint. It was not until a few days had passed that a civilian retrieved the handprint, chiseling it out of the wall. Now, the most important forensic evidence in this young case was eventually turned over to the Atlanta police. That handprint was lost or misplaced. It was never entered into discovery or produced at the eventual murder trial. Quite simply, it disappeared. On the day of the murder, the police arrested 4 different men for the crime: Newt Lee, Arthur Mullinax, James Milton Gant, and the man we now know was the actual killer, Jim Conley. Conley, the factory sweeper, had been seen a day after the murder trying to wash blood out of his shirt. He insisted that it wasn't blood but rust on his shirt. Well, showing no real interest in the evidence, the police either misplaced the shirt, they destroyed it, or they gave it back to Jim Conley. Lacking any evidence, the police let all of the suspects go. The Atlanta police and the Fulton County DA, Hugh Dorsey, they were under pressure to produce a suspect, any suspect. So they settled on a New York Yankee Jew, Leo Max Frank. Frank was an Ivy League educated engineer who was the superintendent of the factory. No other suspect could have looked more other than this northerner who ran a factory staffed by young Southern girls. The day after the murder, the police arrived at Frank's home and arrested him on the spot. Reflecting on Frank's response to his arrest, the prosecution would later declare that Frank was guilty because he looked guilty. Seeing the police arrive at his front door in the early morning had given Frank a start. And the police testimony would later indicate that Frank was nervous, that he looked suspicious. Frank's trial, widely covered around the world, lasted for several weeks. The state's case rested on 4 separate arguments. The prosecution attacked Frank's alibi that he'd been eating lunch at home when the murder occurred. The main witness against Frank was his in-law's cook, Mineola McKnight. She originally testified that Frank had not been present at the exact minute that he claimed to be there. But McKnight had been coached by the prosecution. She later recanted her testimony, saying that the police had threatened her unless she testified against Frank. The second approach of the prosecution was to depict Frank as sexually rapacious. Conley testified that he'd seen Frank in compromising situations with young factory girls. Some of the factory girls testified that Frank had ogled them or been flirtatious. Some witnesses recanted that testimony. The third argument of the prosecution was that there was forensic evidence that proved that Fagan had been killed in the room next to Frank's office. The evidence consisted of a few strands of hair lodged in one of the machines used to make pencils. The prosecution would argue that the hair found had to have been Mary Fagan's. However, the coroner informed the police that the hair found in the factory was not Mary Fagan's. Fagan's body had been exhumed and a lock of hair was taken from her head. It did not match the hair which was lodged in the factory machine. The prosecution never informed the jury of the identification of the hair. Once again, the evidence was suppressed, conveniently misplaced, or destroyed. Now, the fourth and the final argument rested on the sole testimony of Jim Conley. Conley testified that Frank had written a series of murder notes that were found near the girl's body, and that Frank had instructed Conley to take Fagan's body to the cellar by means of the elevator. Conley lied about using the elevator. It was clear from the coal dust that filled Fagan's lungs that she'd actually been assaulted in the basement. Jim Conley, a career criminal, lied several times on the stand. His perjured testimony was he didn't write the murder notes because he couldn't read or write. When the defense produced evidence that Conley could in fact read and write, so he changed his story to say, well, he could read and write, but he had not written the murder notes found near the body. When the defense argued that it was Conley's handwriting on the notes, then Conley admitted he had written the notes, but that he'd been instructed to do so by Frank. From the evidence of the trial, as well as the later testimony of William Smith, Conley's own lawyer, historians know that Conley had been coached by the police to give false testimony. After a 3-week trial, Frank was convicted and sentenced to death by hanging. Frank was not even present in the courtroom when the sentence was read, a precaution since the lawyers assumed that if Frank were in the courtroom, violence would ensue. After the guilty verdict, the legal team asked for an extraordinary motion for a new trial. The motion was denied. Frank's lawyers appealed the decision to the Georgia Supreme Court, who upheld the guilty verdict. Now, there may have been some intimations of antisemitism or prejudice during the time of the original trial, but now it was ramped up to the extreme. Tom Watson, the man who was the inspiration for the later lynching, now attacked Frank every day in his newspapers that he owned. Frank was a sexual predator, Watson now wrote, and hence, by extension, all Jews must be predators. Now, Watson had been a liberal in race relations early in his career, but now that he owned his own newspapers, he attacked daily African Americans, Catholics, and especially Jews. And through his newspaper, he whipped up the citizens of Marietta and encouraged them to lynch Frank. Now, eventually, the case came before the United States Supreme Court, which upheld the conviction 7-2. One of the dissenting votes came from Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, who felt that the Atlanta jury had been intimidated by the hostile crowds who surrounded the courthouse during the trial, hungry for Frank's conviction. By 1915, Frank ran out of options for further conviction relief, but he did have 3 unlikely supporters who were convinced of his innocence. The first one, surprisingly, was the trial judge himself, Judge Leonard Roan. After the trial had been concluded, Judge Rohn revealed that he had doubts all along about Frank's guilt. Rohn believed that the state had failed to convict Frank beyond a shadow of a doubt. The only conclusion for Judge Rohn was that Frank was innocent. But shortly thereafter, Judge Rohn became ill. He never had the chance to communicate his findings to the higher court. The second person to know that Frank was innocent was Governor John Slayton. Of his own accord, Slayton read thousands of pages of testimony and other findings. Slayton even toured the basement where the little girl had been murdered. By 1915, the governor was convinced of Frank's innocence. Weighing the threat of violence against himself and against Frank, the governor commuted Frank's sentence from death to life imprisonment. He told his advisors that he would commute Frank's sentence to give him time for an additional appeal. Finally, in what has to be the strangest twist and turn in this unusual case, William Smith, Conley's own lawyer, turned against his own client. Through an examination of the Fagan murder note, Smith discovered that the handwriting was definitely Conley's handwriting, and that the black slang of the notes could only have been produced by Conley himself. Frank would not have known any of the black slang expressions in the note. It was clear then that Conley had composed the notes all by himself without any direction from Leo Frank. The trial judge, the governor of the state, the lawyer for the killer, all knew that Frank was an innocent man who had been convicted of a crime he never committed. Having been sentenced to life imprisonment, Frank was now sent to the state prison in Milledgeville to wait until a new appeal could be produced. Another trial was never conducted because 3 months later, a group of residents from Marietta took Frank out of the prison and they lynched him on land owned by the Cobb County Sheriff, literally just a few miles from here. None of the lynchers or the planners of the lynching were ever prosecuted. Now, the story might end here, save for a startling event that occurred in 1982. That year, an elderly fellow, Alonzo Mann, came forward to a reporter from the Nashville Tennessean. Mann explained that he'd been a young boy who'd worked in the pencil factory in 1913. He now, many years later, testified that he had seen Jim Conley, and only Jim Conley, with the lifeless body of the girl. Leo Frank was nowhere near the body, may have not even been in the factory at the time, he said, and Leo Frank had no involvement in the crime. Conley warned Alonzo Mann, the young boy, that if he told anybody of what he had seen, then Conley, he would murder him as well. Now, before his statement was released to the public, the newspaper had a number of lie detector tests given to Mann. He passed the test, and his narrative fit what had long been presumed. So 2 years later, in 1984, the Anti-Defamation League petitioned the Georgia Board of Pardons and Paroles to exonerate Frank. They refused any post-conviction relief for him. In 1986, the ADL once again petitioned the Board of Pardons and Paroles, who this time agreed to revisit the case. Now, at that point, in 1986, they offered what has been called a sort of provisional pardon. The board offered Frank a pardon because the state had failed to protect Frank from the lynchers. They still refused to actually exonerate him. 110 years have passed since the original verdict. Leo Frank has never been exonerated of a murder he did not commit. Even 110 years later, Leo Frank's name has never been cleared. My life with Leo Frank actually began in 1995. That spring, I received a phone call from a Marietta resident who asked if I wanted to learn something about Marietta's Jewish history. I assented, and we agreed to meet on the corner of Fry's Gin Mill and Roswell Road. It's just a few blocks from across the Big Chicken. I arrived at that address to find a small office building. Maybe it had 5 or 6 office suites. There was a dentist office and an accountant's office. And the gentleman who called me met me outside in the small parking lot. He said something like, "This is where it happened. I thought you should know." And then he got into his car and drove off. It all happened so quickly, I don't even remember the man's name. But I do remember realizing what he must have been talking about. You see, the lynching tree was long gone, but the parking lot I was standing in was steeped in Jewish blood. I had just discovered the little piece of land where Leo Frank was lynched. And so later that summer, I placed a plaque on the Frank lynching site that read, Leo Frank, falsely charged, wrongly convicted, wantonly murdered. I held the first Yizkor memorial service ever held on the site of the Frank lynching. Since that time, that little office building and its parking lot where Frank was killed, a few years ago, was actually bought by the State Department of Transportation. Ironically, the state has chosen to build a superhighway, essentially a cover-up over the land where the lynching occurred. Now, the actual site of the Frank lynching tree, well, could only happen in Georgia, right? A Waffle House stands over where the tree, I kid you not, a Waffle House stands over where the tree used to be. A few years after that, a friend named Jerry Klinger and I lobbied the state to place a Leo Frank memorial plaque across the street from where the lynching occurred. It still stands there now. I visit it every year to say the mourner's Kaddish on August the 17th on the street that overlooks the site of the most anti-Semitic event in American history. So, all historians now acknowledge that Frank was innocent of any crime and that he deserves complete exoneration. And as you know well, I am dedicated to achieving that exoneration for Leo Frank. Now, it's pretty clear why I'm so concerned about the case. I won't let go, because an innocent man's name needs to be cleared. You see, I bring the Frank case to your attention because it's still relevant to this day. How hard would it be for the Georgia Board of Pardons and Paroles to finally exonerate an innocent man? How difficult would it be for a Fulton County judge to overturn or set aside the original verdict, which would have the effect of exonerating Leo Frank? I know that some people ask, why is the Frank case, why is it still important? The Frank case and his exoneration is important because we're still fighting anti-Semitism here in Marietta that began with the Leo Frank lynching. The Frank case and his exoneration is important because we hope to leave our children with a better picture of their future, and we cannot make our future good unless we've made our past right. The Frank case and his exoneration is important because, as I like to say, we're living in the newer South. And in that newer South, we are ready to struggle with a difficult past in order to prepare for a better future. The Frank case and his exoneration is important because justice delayed is justice denied. The Frank case and his exoneration is important because justice is the debt that the present owes the future. The Frank case and his exoneration is important because there's no shelf life on justice. The Frank case and his exoneration is important because there's no statute of limitations on doing the right thing. The Frank case and his exoneration is important to us here at TKE because we must remain ever vigilant of the dangers of anti-Semitism. And so, coming out of my conclusion, people do say to me from time to time, the case is 110 years old. Why don't you just forget it? Well, the answer to that question is pretty straightforward. I can't forget it. I tell them that history depends on us, that we Jews cannot afford to forget. We cannot forget it because, you see, at the end of the day, we Jews may suffer from many diseases. We suffer from many diseases. It's just that amnesia isn't one of them. Good morning and Yud Yontif.